This is going to be a video kind of talking about the Bill Nye Ken Ham debate. I didn't watch it. I don't plan on watching it. I've seen similar debates in the past, and I think it's very interesting how at a topical level this is supposedly a debate about the truth or falsehood of either evolution or creationism. But the subtext, the actual thing that's being debated here, is who is going to use the might of the state and how are they going to use it. And the scientific or theological arguments are pretexts for that point. And I think that's the most interesting thing. And this, I didn't watch the debate. Seeing other people who made videos about it, especially, what's his name? Jamie, I forget the comic book guy. The comments in his video, of course, a lot of secular, left-wing people came out, and the debates in the comments, kind of illustrate this point more than the actual debates ever do. I will say on Ken Ham, I've known about him for about almost 10 years, since 2003, 2004. The same person actually who introduced me to Ron Paul, Joe Sobran, Scott Horton, and anarcho-capitalism, who was a local sort of like television host to an evangelical Christian, non-denominational, very smart, very into politics, very fundamentalist. He would refer people to Answers in Genesis, which is the website put forth by Ken Ham. And just for fun, I would go to it quite regularly just to see what they had to say, just to see some of the arguments. They and Kent Hovind are, I think, kind of fun to watch. Silly. Bill Nye, on the other hand, Bill Nye really disappointed me. I watched a clip of him on Stossel, and Stossel and the other commentators would ask, "What's the evidence that the temperature is going up?" And his only point was to say the population is going up, as if the way you measure temperature is with a capitation count. We go around and count all the people, and that means the temperature is going up. And I think the correlation there is not shown, and even if there was, there would be a correlation causation fallacy. If he had been there to debate overpopulation or population growth, it would have made sense. I understand there's a certain logic there that more people creates more carbon emissions, and carbon dioxide raises the temperature, but the role that carbon dioxide plays in temperature increases, how it relates, is actually not clear. There's a correlation, but there's not a causal relationship necessarily. There are reciprocal things, there are feedback loops. The number of variables involved is so huge that we don't really have a clear idea. This isn't, by the way, to deny that it's true. It's just that it's far from certain. It's not. I don't want to get into a debate about anthropogenic global warming. I just think it's kind of odd that when asked to show that the Earth is warming, he would simply just keep reasserting how big the population is and how much it's grown. Population has not grown apace, or the temperature is not growing apace with population. Otherwise, the temperature would have, been exponentially growing or whatever. That's not really true either. You can fit the data to be exponential for a little bit, but it doesn't actually stay that way for very long. Anyway, side topic. These debates, ultimately, it's very interesting. What we have going on here is a very intense battleground in the culture war. And you have on the one side secular atheists, mostly, and leftists in general. And on the other side, you have a whole bunch of evangelical Christians, some of which aren't even necessarily that evangelical. And there's a lot of people in the world who have an axe to grind with Christianity, some of which is legitimate, most of which I think is not. I think there's a lot of conflation with blaming a religion and a theology with all kinds of things that, as a libertarian, I'm more likely to blame on politics and government. And even if I am going to say some of this can be faulted with religion, I don't think it's near as much as people like to say. And beyond that, I think it's a little bit dangerous to fault an ideology. I think it's very morally difficult to start talking about how people believe, especially an ideology that is metaphorical, that is talking about metaphysics, as opposed to a political ideology. If I have a political ideology and it says X and then I do X, okay, that political ideology is probably not very good. If I have a theology that says all these really weird abstract things that you can draw any conclusion from, it's kind of less hard to, or less likely that I can really condemn it. But yeah, I'm not going to say Christianity's great or super vital. I think the influence on Western civilization is very deep and very obvious, impossible to deny, and simply a matter of fact at this point. It probably is diminishing somewhat, although it's still significant. But I think that for some reason these people have a really strong axe to grind. I think mostly it's unjustified, and from their perspective, I think what they're seeing, what they want, what they think is that, well, we can use the government to fight religion. We can use the power and might of the state to undermine Christianity. Religion generally, but specifically Christianity. And I think that this is both incorrect. I don't think that this is an effective way to fight Christianity or any religion for that matter. And it also is worse. This is something that the proposed remedy is worse than the perceived harm. And I believe it's really it's interesting. You know, we have these debates, and I think one thing to remember about evolution, I always have believed in evolution. I have moderately religious parents, but they were never young earth creationists. Adam and Eve was a story I was aware of, but I never took it to be literal. I remember when I was in 4th grade, PBS did a series of documentaries hosted by Walter Cronkite about, you know, the origins of man, looking at the early fossil stuff, talking about the Leakeys, Aldovai Gorge, all that stuff. And I just remember finding it fascinating and interesting. And from that point on, evolution, and particularly human evolution. Early on, I did a lot of study of like dinosaurs and brachiopods and other kinds of fossils. But you know, my interest in human evolution, because I think it's that much more directly relevant than, say, the evolution of mussels or whatever, brachiopods or you know, Archaeopteryx or whatever. It has really drawn a lot of my attention, and I keep up with it as much as I can. I wish there was vastly more material. My curiosity is not even close to being sated by what we currently know, and so there's never been any kind of question in my mind. The evolutionary process is generally correct. Now the specifics, and this is interesting, an interesting point, are always changing. The direct, explicit, accepted consensus genealogy, and there isn't really a consensus beyond a very vague sense, is always changing. Not always, but it's every new discovery is altering it in some way. And even at the micro level, I think there's always new understandings that are making what would be in a textbook 1 or 2 years ago invalid or obsolete to one extent or another. And this is kind of, but all that being said, evolution is really not that important. Most people in their lives can get by just fine and have either consciously not believe in evolution, they can believe in creationism or something else, or simply completely be apathetic and have no knowledge whatsoever about where we came from and be fine. You can have a job, you can have an income, you can be intelligent, you can be well-read, you can have a high-functioning life, you can put gas in your car, you can manage your bank accounts, you can do almost everything. There's a tiny, infinitesimal almost sliver of society where you have to know evolution, and then there's probably a marginally wider area that it's really good to know, it's very helpful. So they're probably related fields of science and research in biology or whatnot, where having a really good understanding of evolution is probably very helpful. That's a tiny, I shouldn't say infinitesimal, but a tiny sliver of the population. The rest of us, it doesn't make a big difference either way. But I think, you know, the retort to that is it doesn't matter, it's true. No, it's true, and where this is kind of really revolving around is the schools. What should be taught in the schools? You know, the evolutionists, not just the evolutionists, the secular humanists, the atheists, the statheists really, say, well, we have to, you know, evolution is important, and it has to be, because it's true, it has to be in the schools. And lots of things are true. There's the number of things that are considered true, either scientifically or historically or grammatically or philosophically, or whatever other study of, understanding of the world that you have, is a huge volume of material. Just evolution by itself, even assuming, realizing that there are changes all the time in what we think and what's generally thought to be correct, and incorporating areas where there isn't actually a general consensus. That would be, in and of itself, enough to fill an entire 12-year education. Just evolution, with nothing else. But likewise, your entire education could be consumed with just American history, or just literature, or just some other kind of science, astronomy, or biology, or chemistry, or geology, or theology could be studied that long. And those are just examples. Pretty much any field that has a title can be fleshed out enough to fill a 12-year curriculum. And so it's very interesting when I hear people say, but evolution is true. That doesn't mean that it has a place necessarily in public schools, because almost the totality of things that are true don't have a place in public schools as it is. And not just really minute things that people can kind of dismiss. There's plenty of things that can make a very strong argument that are important, that are necessary, that are valid, that are plausibly useful to a person in their development or in their pedagogy, that have no place in public schools. And I don't see how evolution is particularly that different. In fact, of all the things I can think of, I think there's a whole host of things that are a lot more relevant than evolution. Economics probably tops that list for me anyway. And obviously just my personal preference is history. But I think even things like music and literature are probably more important for some kind of generically understood pedagogy, which is the other problem. I don't think there is such a thing as a generic objective pedagogy. Even if we were to assume that evolution is important, and it is true, which I do, I assume both, that doesn't tell us what its place in education should be. Should it be mentioned once? Should it take a whole semester? Should it take an entire year? And I think the only correct answer here is that the premise is false, that there is no such thing as an objective pedagogy, a one-size-fits-all curriculum. And we can argue here and say that there is variation with curriculums in public schools, and there is, but it's pathetically minor. The requirements that are put forward for schools, it's a very interesting story where the requirements are coming from. It's a lattice work of state, federal, and local mandates, and ultimately NGOs, think tanks like the Rockefeller, the Carnegie, and the Ford Foundation, and other like foundations, have an extremely huge influence ultimately on what's happening. It's very indirect, but the genesis of a lot of what's going to be in the curriculum is actually coming from groups like that. And when it's all fleshed out, an individual school ultimately doesn't have very much choice in what they can offer their students. There can be slight variation, but it's tiny compared to the variation in needs. Every single person is unique. Every single person is going to have different abilities, different proclivities, different interests, things that they are not very good at, things that they are very good at, goals, all kinds of things. And most we can have, even if we only include conclusions that are widely considered to be valid. So let's exclude right now the people who just want to be surfers, or who just want to ski all the time, or who want to maybe be painters. Let's exclude the stuff that people can dismiss as plausibly not that likely, and just include legitimate, realistic, career-oriented kind of stuff. The number of different curriculums that would be entailed by that would be astronomically huge, and the number that we actually get is ridiculously minuscule in comparison. Not to mention how ineffective they're actually put forward. And so it's a very, very debatable question what role, if any, evolution should have in curriculum. Now, if we were going to have tailored curriculums, and there were people who were really interested in biology, or really interested in anthropology, or really interested in paleontology, then yes, evolution would make a whole lot of sense in those. But for others, less so. So why is there such an emphasis? What is if it's so debatable, if it's so inconclusive, if there's so little rationale for emphasizing evolution at all, let alone as something that's really important, why is there such acrimony over this? What's the motivation? And I think it's pretty obvious. It's very obvious. The secular humanists are trying to wage a war on religion, and they think that by inserting evolution into public schools, that they can destroy, defeat, weaken religion. And I think that they're morons for believing that. So the best that can be said, and this is assuming the public schools teach it in a convincing way, that the social structure that's supporting the religion is incapable of supplanting, which it's not. And that's the thing people have to realize about Ken Ham and Kent Hovind. They're not talking to an atheist scientist trying to convince them. They're not talking to a secular humanist liberal, sitting there on their couch, who never believed in God and who's always been an atheist. They're not talking to you. They're talking to the masses of fundamentalist Christians, to the creationists who already exist, and their arguments are tailored to appeal to them, to touch their buttons. And so when they cite the Bible, it sounds to a scientific person like, okay, it's the Bible, it's fallible, it's irrelevant. Him citing Genesis doesn't matter. It doesn't, it's citing Bronze Age fiction or whatever, or early Iron Age anyway. But to a person who's been raised religiously, that's an authoritative source. It is the authoritative source, and so it matters. And I think Ken Ham and Kent Hovind know this. Maybe I'm wrong. They could believe exactly what they're saying, but they're targeting to those people, and so the number that you're going to lose because of facts is relatively limited. But even, let's say you convince someone that evolution is true, it doesn't mean they're not going to be a Christian. Doesn't mean, all it means is they're going to shrug and they're going to say, and Genesis is metaphorical. It's not literal. That doesn't mean they don't believe in God. There's a metaphysical hole big enough for the Abrahamic God to hide in that no number of Lucys or Denisovans or Taung babies are going to be able to dig out. And that's not to say that I'm asserting that such a God exists. I'm just saying that evolution is not a tool capable of dislodging that type of religion. And that's kind of the shift that we're hearing. So you have lots of people who are theists, who are Christians, who believe in evolution. And so you haven't really, all you've really done is made the religion better. You've made it stronger, more than anything else, more than you've weakened it. For every person who you've converted into an atheist, there's probably more people who either didn't change, or if they did change, they adopted a type of Christianity that is much less susceptible to argumentation against it. Which, to me, doesn't seem like it's necessarily, I don't care. I mean, that's fine with me. But if your goal is to eliminate Christianity, I have a hard time thinking that that's going to be really helpful. That's what they think is going to happen. That's what their hope is. Their hope is we're going to use public schools as a weapon against our cultural enemies. And here's the other thing, though, that they don't understand. It's transparently obvious that that's what's going on. It's obvious that when we have debates about evolution, it's about what's going to be taught in schools, and are the schools going to be used to influence society. And the thing is, all the theists, all the creationists, all the fundamentalist Christians out there, they know that that's what's happening, and they're going to react against it. They're not going to sit by and go, oh, go ahead and use the might of the state to attack our beliefs. They're not going to sit by idly and allow that to happen. And who can blame them for not wanting to do that? I don't understand. When I was talking to that liberal earlier, one of the points, and he actually, to his credit, listened to this, I said, you can't expect tens of millions, if not hundreds, and I've heard estimates that the number of people in the U.S. who think the Earth is less than 10,000 years old is over 100 million. You can't expect those people. You can't go to them and tell you, you owe all these taxes, all these property taxes, and whatever other kind of taxes to pay for schools. It's your obligation to pay for them, but you don't get to have any say in the curriculum. That's completely ridiculous. You cannot, in good faith, offer that as a way of cooperating with people. You cannot go to them and say, you're obligated to pay for this school and this curriculum, but I get to dictate what's actually taught. And I want to teach stuff that's actually going to attack your way of life and your ideology and your theology. what do you expect their reaction is going to be? Of course they're going to go and vote for politicians who are going to start saying, let's have it where we teach creationism on the side a little bit, or let's not teach either one. You've just politicized the entire issue, and that's an inevitable result of public schools generally, whether it was this issue or something else. We have the intractable fact that educational goals, for either legitimate disagreements or absurd theology reasons, are going to be mutually exclusive, probably for anything that we can point to. I mean, even something like physical education. You're going to have some people who are going to want something completely different from other people, and they both can't be served equally. And that's true for anything. Anything. The teaching of history, what some people want is going to be different from what other people want. And it's not even dependent on, well, what's true gets taught and what's not true isn't taught. There's plenty of things that are true but are mutually exclusive when it comes to being fulfilled. Because there's not enough time and resources to give everybody whatever it is that they want. And that would be the solution, though, would be to say, okay, creationists can have their own schools where they teach whatever they want, and they do this in homeschooling. And contrary to the shrill arguments of the liberals, they can go to their home schools or their religious private schools. They can receive their creationist indoctrination. They'll get educated in other things that the parents think are important, which tend to be things that we agree on, like reading and writing and arithmetic. And in terms of results, they do better than the students who go to the public schools and get their evolutionary education. Now, there's lots that sometimes homeschoolers exaggerate the difference, and there's also a question of how valid is the rubric, how valid are the tests. Let's see. Get in focus again. So much of school, it's interesting, like the rubric that the public schools use to determine whether they're doing a good job is to test everybody. ACT, SAT. You know, when I was in Michigan, there was something called the MEAP, the Michigan Educational Achievement something. I don't even remember. You know, this is how they measure. And when you use that rubric, you know, homeschool and private schools are better than public schools. Now, I know there's things that we could say, well, there's selection bias and all the poor kids are going to public school, and so the average is going up. Of course, when they study and they control and they have poor kids go to homeschool, they do better again. Also, with the races, the difference between whites and blacks tends to go away with homeschooling. It's very, very pronounced in public schools. But you know, the idea that testing is even a valid rubric. You know, I have a book here. I have not read it yet, but it's called Measuring Up: What Educational Testing Really Tells Us, which I believe the conclusion of the book is nothing. And here's the book, by the way. And you could say, well, that's just something you found on Lou Rockwell. He's just some stupid libertarian, spouting his nonsense. But it's actually a guy named Daniel Koretz. That's K-O-R-E-T-Z. Is a professor of education at Harvard University. So this isn't just some libertarian, but the conclusion of this book is that testing doesn't tell you anything. It's a huge waste. But that's the rubric published. But even if we accept that rubric, the homeschoolers getting their creationism are still doing better than the public schoolers. So, what's the argument here? What's the argument here? It's who's going to control the government, who's going to control this particular, in this case, this particular arm of the government. And that's what they're all worked up about. And, the leftists, and I've heard this from other people. I've had a whole bunch of gay people tell me that my arguments sound good. It sounds good, like it sounds awesome. It sounds plausible that homeschooling and private schooling could work and are effective and are cost effective and are even produce better results. But I'm not against. I'm still in favor of public schools, and I think they should be mandatory. Why? Because I want to be able to control society. Because I want to have the power to force everybody to believe what I want to believe. Like, I've had people literally tell me that. And the thing is, then everyone's going to be fighting for it. And so you're arguing for the power, this power that you think you're going to wield. It's like you're advocating something on the assumption that it's going to be you holding the reins of power. You know, you're in favor of a Leviathan state because you imagine yourself as the dictator. But the problem is you're not going to be the dictator. You're going to be the recipient of that power. It's going to be abusing you along with everybody else. And you're just making it easier for it by justifying its existence in the first place. You know, I see an awful lot of this. People want a public school system because they think that the curriculum is then going to be whatever they want, and that's not true. That's not true. I can't show me a liberal, like a sincere secular atheist liberal, who can look at a public school curriculum and say, that's it, that they've nailed it. That's exactly what I think. Like, if that's their case and they're not critically thinking, then they're an idiot. I think most of them, though, if they're being honest, now in the context of a debate like this, if I was to take a liberal who was just watching and say, here, you tell me that, you know, I think it's fine. But if I was to just approach them, like, would you just look at this, you know, no libertarian, you know, rhetoric aside, do you think this curriculum is a good idea? They say, no, this could be improved in this or this, that way or whatever. But they're going to justify the system on the assumption that it's going to meet whatever their imagination demands, not how it's actually going to be run. You know, completely ignoring the vested interests that are involved, completely ignoring the fact that the state has an interest. You know, the state has a vested interest in how people think. It's obvious. The state doesn't want people who are high-functioning enough that they could question the state in whatever way, economically, philosophically. You know, they don't. That it makes no sense to educate people to become high-functioning enough that they don't need you. If people are independent, people are able to take care of themselves, then what need is there for the state? It's either nothing or considerably less than we have now. I mean, there could be an argument made for public goods, and, you know, I'm not going to dismiss the minarchists who make serious arguments, but even those would even only allow for a very small amount of government, revolutionarily less than we have now. And the state's never going to train people to be that way. If they had a pedagogy that could produce high-functioning individuals who were completely capable of not only taking care of themselves but producing a surplus, we'd have no need for them. And so they're never going to train people to be that way. But people don't but these advocates, they don't think of public schools as something that has the interests of the state in mind. They don't think of it as something that has the vested interests of, you know, teachers unions or the administrators or the contractors who build them or the textbook companies. All they see is a hypothetical imaginary entity that's going to do whatever they think is best. You know, it's like everyone gets to imagine that they're the king of the world. You know, when they go around advocating that public schools be mandated, that everybody go, it's their own little petty tyranny where they think they're going to rule over everybody. And then they advocate the system, and then the rule goes to Barack Obama or whatever the plutocrats are around whom we're really controlling the strings, or whoever has the most influence, which is never going to be you. It's never going to be your friends. It's never going to be Sam Harris. It's never going to be anything like that. And the people who get to that point, what their primary interest is their own power, their own aggrandizement, not some philosophical purity. They're not going to go. Barack Obama is not going to wage a war against Christianity because that would hurt his power. There's too many Christians. He would make an enemy of tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people. He wants to rule those people. He wants those people to be pliant cattle. He doesn't want them to be upset because their religion's getting offended. So he's not going to, and you know, good savvy politicians can gauge their audience. And if you go to a fundraiser where it's a whole bunch of left-wing liberals, then he can talk about people clutching their Bibles and clutching their guns. All right, when he gets out on TV and he's talking to a different audience, and then you think, oh, he's one of us, you know, he believes in what I believe, I'm going to support him, I'm going to vote for him, I'm going to send him money, and I'm going to go on comment threads and defend him against, you know, all those evil libertarians who don't like him very much. But he just played you like a fiddle. That's what politicians do. You know, and the monolithic compulsory education system that, you know, you laud so much, you're lauding it because you think it's going to be something that it never will be. And you're hurting the rest of us in the process. And, you know, you're only waiting for the day, ironically, for the creationists to actually take over and then actually start forcing people to learn creation. Not saying I predict that's going to happen. I think it's very unlikely. And it might be argued here that, you know, being a little hard, you know, can all these arguments against the liberals, couldn't they be leveled against the theocratic people as well? I don't think so. Not to that extent, anyway. You know, people have asked me things like, well, you know, you shouldn't like Gary North or ever listen to him because he thinks that you should be stoned to death because you're homosexual. it's not a threat if the chances of its being fulfilled are extremely low. You know, a worm struggling against an eagle is not threatening the eagle. But Gary North, supposedly, people have said this. I have not heard him say this before, but I know enough to think it could be true, that homosexuals should be stoned to death. When was the last time anyone in the United States was stoned to death? This never happened. It never happened at the height of the Massachusetts Bay Colony or the Plymouth Colony. The height, you know, during the Salem witch trials, nobody was stoned to death. And that's the pinnacle of theology in the United States. Never got anywhere close to that. So the idea that, and what are the odds that we would revert back to that state? I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm saying it's so unlikely that I'm not threatened by somebody who's advocating that. You know, whereas a secular humanist left-winger, an atheist warmonger who's up in arms about the fairy tales people believe, which couldn't raise, you know, a single word against a president who's drone striking weddings, who's spying on every, like, that's what they're concerned about. They're concerned about Ken Ham. They're concerned about answers in Genesis. They're concerned about a playground that depicts humans playing with dinosaurs. You know, that's what's really bugging them in the world. That, you know, not the mass murder, mass homicide, mass kleptocracy, mass surveillance state, police state, you know, of this government and other governments, who they support. It's funny. They take the side of the tyrant over the people who believe in the Bible because, why? Because the Bible people are so much worse. And again, there's a whole thing where religious people support the government too for all kinds of reasons, because of Romans 13, or just because they're national, they're conservative and they're nationalists, and like, you know, they believe in their religion because they're conservative about it, and they believe in nationalism because they're conservative about it, and they kind of make this big God, Jesus, American flag pie, and it's a disgusting thing also, and I'm not justifying that in the least. But I'm just saying the theology on its own, you know, the belief in, you know, 7-day creation of the earth a few thousand years ago by omniscient, omnipotent being. Come on, is that really like hurting me or anybody else? No, it's not. It's not a big deal. And believing in that, I don't see how that necessarily means that they're going to become pro-government. Maybe there's other parts of their religions that do make people, you know, there's plenty. I know the Christian anarchists out there would debate this, and, you know, have at it, guys. It's not a place I'm really qualified to talk about. But the motivation of the left atheists is such transparently a will to power that they are just salivating at the idea of controlling other people's lives, and it's disgusting. It's revolting. And what else are they going to use it for? Like, it would be one thing if, well, the only thing we're going to use, the ultimate power of ideological, you know, omnipotence, is to make people believe in evolution. Okay, like, there could be worse things, but that's it? That's all you're going to use it for? No way. No way. And then the thing they can't understand is why people want to debate them or get upset or try and, you know, rush the school boards to make them include creationism. It's because David Rockefeller was wrong. We're not helpless people yielding ourselves to your guiding hands. You know, people, if it's not subtle, if it's subtle enough, maybe they don't notice. But if it's overt, and this is so funny, is these, you know, oh, I'm so sophisticated, I'm this smart person, you know, I don't believe in a Bronze Age, you know, religion. Oh, wow, you're a genius. And then you're like as blatantly obvious as, you know, a guy who just walks up and steals a candy bar right in front of the cash register. Like, people are going to, they know what you're doing, and they're going to resist you. And then, you know, like, why are you resisting me? Because you're being transparently aggressive against their life, against their livelihood, against their way of, not their livelihood, but the way they see the world, their ideology. Of course they're going to defend themselves. Rhetorically so far, and that's fine. Like, it's, and there's this long-standing debate kind of among libertarians, like, what would you prefer, a government run by atheists or a libertarian society full of theists? And to me, this is such a no-brainer. Like, I don't even know how anybody without very strange priorities could ever have any question about this. I wish that this was a dichotomy that I was actually faced with. Unfortunately, it's not. Because there's absolutely no question I would take the latter. Like, and I don't. I think the reasons are pretty obvious. Why would you want? Who cares how logical your tyrant is? You know, it's irrelevant. And there again, who cares about the superstitions of your non-coercive neighbors? Right? I don't see any other way of looking at it than that. You know, and if you're so hung up on your atheism, I don't know how you can't be defined by atheism. It's a null hypothesis. You know, not a null hypothesis, and you know, that's not the correct terminology, but it's you don't believe in one particular myth. That's the definition of who you are. It's like I'm gonna go around like, oh yeah, I don't believe in the Aboriginal creation myth of Queensland. Like, so what? Oh, you're gonna spend the rest of your life like harping on that forever, and then you're gonna build like a monolithic state to try and stop people from believing it? Come on, that's ridiculous. You know, find something more valuable in your life to define yourself by than that. And the other thing is, you're destroying the rest of us. You're helping, you know, contributing to that, to the aggrandizement of the state and to the impoverishment of the rest of us because of your advocacy. You know, not all of them. Look, it's actually an interesting thing. Even though homeschooling is kind of considered like the fundamental Christian escape from the secular public schools, it actually didn't start that way. The movement, the modern movement, it's been legal right along, but the modern movement, well, I don't know if it's actually been legal right along. You have to look at a state-by-state basis. But the kind of modern movement started in the 60s, and it was counterculture hippies who were like, I don't want the man teaching my kids all wrong or whatever. And there's plenty of atheists who homeschool their kids. In fact, there's a really good, he never makes videos any longer, not that I've seen in years, but there was, they call it home education in the UK, but there was a YouTube user named Rowan Fortune Wood, I want to say. Long hair, glasses, extremely well-read, extremely articulate, super into literature, but he was homeschooled in the UK, and he's a total atheist. And his parents were atheists, and they just thought, you know what, public schools suck, so we're going to homeschool our kid, and you know what, it turned out really well. He's highly intelligent. So it's actually kind of a false dichotomy when we start talking about homeschooling equals theology fundamentalism. Yes, there's a high correlation, but there's nothing necessarily true about that. So I'm not, my criticism is certainly not of all atheists. Certainly not. It's of stateists. And they can go fuck themselves, and I don't care, you know, how much they hate theology. I'm not going to support their building or supporting or aggrandizing or extending the public school apparatus or the government apparatus because, you know, they have a vendetta against the superstitions of people who they really don't even need to interact with if they don't want to. So, I don't know. That's pretty much it, and I'll talk to you all later.